City Matters.
Welcome back here to the Fog of War Humanity. I'm your host, Richard Acritelli, here on hmTv. We just have been speaking for the last couple episodes on the bridge from Saigon with our guest, Mai, and her unbelievable story of being a young girl here in America, Philadelphia, and her family's pursuit of the American dream. And very interesting how they all attended Ivy League schools, and the father was an educator here for a very long time. Now, you spoke, Mai, about your brothers with the sports, right? Wrestling, running, being very good students. They seem like, that they had done very well for themselves, right? Now, when you're in high school, what were the certain things that you like to do? Was there any hobbies, any sports? Any studies that you gravitated towards?
I think I was one of those all-arounder kids. I did a little bit of everything. I played music. I was in the band and orchestra. I edited the newspaper. I was like an okay junior varsity volleyball player. I would say if there was one thing I really loved, it was history. There was just it was the start of my kind of obsession with World War II in high school, which now at this point in my life I go back to a lot.
Which side of the war do you look? Do you take a look at the Pacific and Asian side, or do you look at the European side, or just in general that you like it?
I probably know more about the European side, but also like on the home front, what happened. And then, the other thing that happened in high school was a teacher of mine introduced me to British Isles music. You're Irish. And it was also the time when I read this book, Trinity. I don't know if
Okay, yeah,
you
sure.
remember. Yeah, great book, right? But there was something about Irish ballads in particular and that book that I gravitated to. I realized because it was about Civil War, right? And immigration. And
Irish got off the boat. They said to the Irish, "You want to become a citizen? You want a job? You want this? You want that? Yeah, sure." They became a citizen and they got drafted right into the army, and they did not have an easy time. Every immigrant group takes it on the chin, right?
right.
Now it's
So I was a weird kid,
yeah.
volleyball music, World War II, and British Isles music.
Well, we wouldn't say weird, well-rounded, right? Right? I mean, yeah. Well, all right. Well, did you get the ball over the net in volleyball?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're holding your own. So, did you really enjoy your teachers? Did you, did you get a kick out of them? Did they really help you out?
I had one teacher in particular who was very important to me. He first taught me math, and then we just became friends and got closer. He I think he saw much more clearly what I could become than I did. Everybody has one of those teachers, right?
Sure.
That just kind of like propels you. And then what happened, which was after I went through medical school and I got married at the end of medical school, he came to my wedding. The following year, almost 1 year later, he and his wife got on TWA Flight 800.
What, 800? Wow, I remember that. I remember the police. I was on the North Shore of Long Island. It was 1996. And they were all going down William Floyd Parkway to go to Smith's Point. The plane was literally about 6 or 7 miles from where I lived. I remember that night. I remember all the police from Suffolk County heading in that southern direction towards the beach, towards Atlantic Ocean.
And I wasn't that far away. I was in Manhattan at the time because I was doing my residency at Columbia in Washington Heights. And and it wasn't until a couple of days later that a high school friend called and told me that he had been on the plane. And so in Bridge from Saigon, I talk about how, like I spent a whole year grieving and the experience of going to his memorial and seeing his family and all that. And then realizing that it
Where was the memorial? Do you remember where the memorial was located?
it was
Wow.
at a Quaker school in Philadelphia. Um, and then what I explain in the book is that it was his passing that made something snap inside me. And just a few months later, I said to my husband, I want to go back to Vietnam. And I didn't kind of wait to see what he would say. I just figured if
Yeah.
he wants to come, he's welcome to come, but I'm going back to Vietnam. And so I mark, my teacher's passing as like the end of my childhood. And it was part of growing up was deciding that I had to go find my own family history because my parents had never wanted to share that with me. And having that kind of like blankness in your understanding of who you are um, was another psychological stress, and I didn't want it anymore. I didn't want to wait for anyone to give it to me anymore.
Now, this educator has big influence on you, right? Just like you're like almost like you're a rock. It sounds like, right? That they saw something in you. You had a good connection. You must have been an outstanding student in high school as well, because just looking at your background, do you go to Harvard first, then Johns Hopkins, or Johns Hopkins and then Harvard? Which one? You go to Harvard first. So, I mean, do you feel as though that teacher helped you a little bit going in that direction, or was it give you a little confidence, or whatever the case is?
He tried.
Yeah,
I didn't believe him for a long time because when you're a teenager, what you care most about are what your peers think, right?
sure.
Um, it wasn't until I was into my adulthood that I fully appreciated what he had done for me. Um, I never felt like I was the best at anything. I felt like I was always number two or number three. That was okay with me. To tell you the truth, Rich, I the only reason I got into Harvard was because well, the only reason I applied to Harvard was because a couple of the other girls in my class that I felt competitive with applied. And so it's like, oh, well, if they're applying, I'll apply. I wasn't sure where Boston was. I
Yeah,
thought Yale
yeah.
was in California. Like,
Did you travel that much outside of Philadelphia? Right? You probably saw family members in Maryland and right. I
right.
mean,
Or like family trips, to the
yeah,
shore, or to Niagara Falls or something, but I didn't know where Boston was. I didn't even know what the Ivy League was.
yeah.
It was just kind of, it just kind of happened.
Let me ask you: the fact that you say, I don't think I matched up, or maybe I wasn't good enough, right, or strong enough. That had to be good because it pushes you a little bit, right? It puts a little fire in you, also, right? Sometimes it's not always the healthiest, but it drives you a little bit, right?
See, this is how I can tell you're a teacher, that you get that psychology. Yeah, it wasn't always healthy. Like it probably, you know, that kind of drive can make a person pretty stressed. But but yeah, it definitely got me to a lot of accomplishments. Eventually, I figured out how to like motivate myself in other ways.
And you're still learning. You're young, you know, you know, no, but I'm not much younger, So, but like you go to Harvard. What is your first semester like in one of the finest colleges in the entire world? I mean, it's you could count on your fingers what schools really rival Harvard, right? Like there's not many, right? That's one of the finest schools. You come over here at 7 years old. About 10 or 11 years later, you're doing all right. You're doing very well, right? And your father, I mean, he's working, he's busy, but in the back of his mind, I mean, he's got to be so proud, right? Where do your brothers end up going? Where do they go? So they go to Penn, right? And then you go to Harvard. That's got to be an unbelievable feeling.
I know they were very proud. I was a solid student. I wouldn't say that um, I was in the upper rung at Harvard by any means. I think I had a really hard time in college, though. It was both my first time really away, but it was also my first time being in that kind of a place. And by that I mean, this was the late 80s, and Boston was a very different place. At that time, it was probably the most racist place I had ever been.
You had all the busing from the 80s, right? 70s and 80s. And that's the irony of it. People always think down south and everything else, it was up here as well, you know?
You have to realize I went to public schools in Philadelphia, which meant my world was, it was, most of the kids were Black. And so to land in Boston and Cambridge was just a real shock to my system. And it just took a lot of getting used to.
Was there a, yeah, but was there a Vietnamese population that had gone to Harvard, or was there any type of Vietnamese population in and around Boston at all?
There was, and there was a group of Vietnamese students on campus, and I did spend time with them. I think it was kind of an interesting mix of people because there were some who were kind of like more of my parents' generation. I don't mean in age, but I mean in mindset. They tended to be more conservative. They tended to um, kind of put some distance between themselves and the American students. And then there were others of us who were like slightly, more assimilated, I guess. And it was kind of an awkward balance there. It was a strange time, I think, to be in this first generation of an immigrant. When you come, you're old enough at age 7 to remember things about your homeland, but not to feel really tied to it.
Yeah.
And then you become really a part of your new land, but not completely either. So again, it's this bridging thing.
Yeah, you're kind of in between, right? All right, so now you meet your husband. As you meet your husband, what are you studying? And then what is he studying?
He was a math geek. So he was a math major, and I was a biochemistry major, which was a mistake. My father was probably correct that I should have been a history major, but that's not how it worked out. I was a pre-med. I wasn't sure I wanted to go to medical school. I just thought science is a safer major than a humanities major. I didn't figure out, I was so reluctant. I was so ambivalent about going to medical school that I actually took a gap year between college and medical school, which was not popular at the time. And it really threw my parents for a loop. But what happened in that year was that I worked for a public health attorney, and I learned about health policy, and I figured, oh, I like that. I like thinking about those things. Now I can go to medical school, and now I know why I want to go to medical school. So that was a really important transition out of college.
So now you go to Harvard, right? You graduate from Harvard. Outside of graduating from Harvard, what was your biggest accomplishment with your education in Harvard?
I think it was, funny enough, learning how to think and how to write. I know that sounds weird, but you're a teacher, and so like if a student can learn how to think logically and then explain that, they're set for life.
It's easier to put things together, and writing is very, very difficult.
And easier to convince people, easier to make things happen. So I think that was the most important thing. I will give Harvard credit for that.
Okay. And your husband, you guys graduate in the same year?
Yes.
So now he's a math major. Does he do engineering after that, or does he do statistics, or what does he do with that?
He dabbled a bit in computer programming, but then he figured out that he was really passionate about what you would call environmental economics. So
Okay.
he went into that for like a decade, and then he switched to when I took him to Vietnam, he turned to development economics, and then he fell in love with that for 10 years. So he's had an interesting career path all on his own.
It's pretty sharp because that development economics, the first time you go over there in 98, Cold War kind of comes to an end, 89, 90, and that's all you have in the 90s, 1990s is that development and redevelopment of areas of the world that just completely changed, right? And like you said, with Vietnam, in the mid to late 1980s, they're trying to pretty much reach outward a little bit more because the Chinese and the Soviets aren't going to be enough, right? And they want to progress and they want to move forward and so on. Now you take a year off, right? And you end up in Johns Hopkins.
Yeah, I went to medical school first at Temple
At
University back in
Temple.
Philly. Yeah. And then I did my clinical training. And then after we got back from
So
Vietnam,
what
I
was
went to
Temple like?
Hopkins.
What was that like? You're now a little bit closer to home, right? What was that like?
I loved medical school and I loved Temple. It was Temple is in North Philly, which is at the time it was a very poor neighborhood, and lots of issues, measles and TB and violence and stuff. And I love serving underserved populations. So that was, and they were really generous in letting me explore different things. So I organized, a 2-day conference on how do you recognize child abuse or domestic violence, and and they just kind of let me be me. It's the first time I really had that. So I loved medical training in part because I knew I wasn't going to be seeing patients the rest of my life. So I just kind of wanted to soak up what I could.
Now you mentioned some of the harder things about disease and poverty and violence in Philly, right? And that's in every city. And but Philadelphia for you, that's your home. That's your hometown. That's what you know. Were you able to work in Philadelphia while you were in medical school at Temple? Like, were you able to do any internships, work with, any of the people to like kind of help with some of these problems?
Yeah, so I mean, as a medical student, you're seeing patients in clinic and in the hospital. I also volunteered at a drug treatment clinic in North Philly for a time, and did just helped out with simple things like doing intake for patients. But I got to watch cool stuff like acupuncture treatments for people with addiction. So that for me, I really, throughout different stages of my clinical training, like medical school, internship, residency, it was really important to me to get off campus and, see patients in community clinics. Um, when I was at Hopkins, which is in East Baltimore, I left the campus clinic and I would go to home healthcare for the homeless and see patients there. So it's just been kind of a pattern for me. And I think a lot of that actually, although he would sort of like be totally surprised to hear it, I think that came from my dad.
Yeah, it's the service in him from being an educator and teaching and right working with others, right? He had to be proud of you with that, I would imagine, right? That you were using your education, you were giving back, you're a good person, you're showing your heart, that sort of thing.
He was proud, but he's also, an immigrant parent. He wanted me to have a McMansion
Yeah.
in the suburbs.
You got to get there too, that sort of thing, right? So it's your background, right? You have a hardworking background itself. Now, as you're going through all of your education, did you ever have like any concerns or any flashbacks from when you were younger or any, because you're busy, right? You're going to Harvard, even though you take a year off, now you're in medical school. Then after that, you're in Johns Hopkins. You're really busy from a young girl playing volleyball and writing the school paper and handling your school responsibilities all the way up. Did you ever have anything, or do you touch upon it in your book where, you might have had moments where, the way you came into the country and how your family had to flee the communists and everything else? Was there ever anything that kind of hurt you as you're growing up?
So one of the things I write about in Bridge from Saigon is realizing when I was 8 or 9 that I had an invisible friend, this character, this boy that I called Michael, who is a little bit older than me. He was actually half American, half Eastern European, and maybe like a little bit of Asian blood in him too. And Michael and I grew up together. Now, I want to be clear that I knew other people couldn't see Michael, but he was very real to me. He he took care of me in a lot of ways. He would reassure me about things when something was hard in my actual life. I could go with him, go away with him in my head, and we would spend time together walking in the woods or riding horses or playing music or ice skating. Um, I would spin these incredible stories about Michael, but it wasn't like make believe in the sense of, writing a novel. It was more like just opening myself up and trying to understand who Michael was. It wasn't until I was well into my 30s, after I'd had my 2 kids and I was having a lot of success professionally in my health policy life, that I kind of had a psychological breakdown. And and because of that, I got myself into therapy. And it was in therapy that I realized, oh, Michael wasn't my fantasy lover or an invisible friend. He's actually a part of me. Um, and that was the start of my coming to realize that I had dissociative identity disorder, which people used to call multiple personality. Um, and it turned out Michael was just one of several characters in my consciousness. Um, and what I learned through that, Rich, was that in fact I had had a lot of traumas in my childhood, some of which I knew about intellectually, but I didn't really appreciate emotionally. Like, it's traumatic for a 7-year-old to be ripped out
Yeah.
of the place she knows, right? It's traumatic to be the first Asian kid and not have in school and not have anything explained to you. Um, it turned out there were other traumas too, and in the book, I talk about how eventually I I learned through my different characters. The other characters are all versions of myself at different ages. And one of them was the most troubled. She was the 8-year old. And it took me a long time in therapy to learn to listen to her and to figure out that she had been raped. Um, and that not coincidentally, if she was raped at age 8, that was when I started seeing and hearing Michael. And so that was, in all likelihood, the trigger for my dissociating. Um, and that process of going into therapy, remembering things, and understanding how my consciousness and my personality had fractured, and then collecting all those stories and putting the pieces back together, it felt a lot, Rich, like the process of discovering and collecting and putting back together my family history. It felt like the same process.
This might be a dumb question, right? But is that almost attributed a little bit to like your own version of like a PTSD, right? In terms of these are things that you recall, these are things you remember. You're a 7-year-old kid, right? I mean, you should have pigtails in your hair and coloring and all these things. At that time, you're on an aircraft, one of the last planes out of Vietnam, right? Your parents know they got to get out of there. And, you know, in some ways, you know, it's very serious. In other ways, you have no idea what's going on, but it stays with you, though. Is that a little bit PTSD that you would think a little bit? Yeah. Because you look at you have what, 2 kids, right? What, a boy and a girl, 2 boys, 2 girls? What do you 2 boys, right? You have grown up a lot different than your sons have grown up. And in some cases, in other cases, they might have played sports, they might have done this, they might have done that, just like you did. But in other cases, you kind of left the frying pan, you know, and you were one of the roughest times in not only Vietnamese but American history as well. Also, you know, that was a tough. That was a very, very extremely tough moment. Like, even you look at like President Gerald Ford when South Vietnam falls, you could see it on the politicians here's face. I was watching something where, and I know you know the stories, when the orphans were put on the plane and the plane crashed 5 miles from, right? And people just, like reporters said, will there ever be any positive news that comes out of this country? You know, it was just a hard moment, right? It was something that just stayed for a long period of time, you know, and you know, it's my take on it.
Yeah. Wars take a really, really long time to end. Sometimes they take generations to end.
Look at your dad, right? I mean, and his family members. It's a tough thing, and listen, you're a functioning adult. You're very successful, right? Very educated. You have your husband, your children, a home, right? You got to keep on moving, but you know that doesn't necessarily mean those things, you know, leave you. You know, you find different ways of coping and dealing and handling hard times, right?
It's one of the things that I really hope people who read Bridge from Saigon take away from it, which is, in many ways, honestly, I'm not sure that my story is all that special. By which I mean, like, there are lots of refugees who had much more dangerous, dramatic things happen to them, people who lost many more family members, Vietnam vets who, you know, experience combat and like that kind of trauma. But I hope people take away is every person is really complicated.
Yeah.
And yeah, and just like being curious about that, because you know we're watching what happens to refugees and immigrants now in America, and what happens to vets now in America. And I think we just sort of see talking points and icons and memes and stuff. There's so many layers, and there's just so much resilience. There's hurt, yes, but also so much resilience.
I would say resilience is a good word for your family, right? For you, your brothers, your parents, even the family members that you've seen back in Vietnam and you keep in touch with, right? I would say resilience is a key word, you know? I mean, the glass hasn't always been half full, right? It's you know, you go through some very, very difficult moments, right?
Yeah, it's it's easy to forget that when you like count all your blessings. Um, but I think that's why it was important to me to write it down was I I want my kids and their kids to know where they came from. And I really want to encourage other people to look at your own family history of immigration. Everyone in this country comes from an immigrant somehow.
Yeah.
And and it's one thing to like track your family tree. It's another thing to try to find those stories. How did your ancestors actually experience it?
Your boys, they go back to Vietnam? Did they go with you?
I did. Yeah, we took them back when they were teenagers, and my older one has been back a couple of times on his own.
And how do they do they speak Vietnamese?
No, I'm a little upset about that because the older one is fluent in Mandarin
Okay.
and Spanish. I'm like, come on, where's the Vietnamese? But
Yeah.
um,
You'll
but
get
no,
there.
they loved it because uh, first of all, it's a beautiful country. We got out into the countryside and we went hiking in rainforests and spelunking in caves, and they love that. And the older one, he's just kind of a sponge, and he's an extrovert, so he just loves all the sights and sounds and things.
But before I let you go for the afternoon, I was curious, are you still do you have any relationships with any other Vietnamese families that came over right around the same time, maybe a little bit before or a little bit after your family came here? Do you still have any other like bonds or relationships with people that fled the country?
Well, my cousins are kind of all over the East Coast, and I live in the DC area, and there's a huge Vietnamese community in Maryland and Virginia. So, I go to Eden Center, which is our little Saigon, pretty frequently, and my aunties and cousins are kind of like my connection to
Good.
that whole world. But it's one of the things that I'm hoping comes out of publishing this book is that, and it's already starting to happen, that I can have more conversations with other Vietnamese Americans about things that we've all experienced.
This has been great. I mean, this is like, this is very beneficial towards me in terms of being very much into history and teaching it, and obviously doing the podcasts and stuff. This is very good. You've lived very much the American dream, and a lot of hard work, sweat and tears and everything that has gone into it. And it's been very interesting to see that part, but also where you came from and how you've kind of dealt with it for your life. And we very much appreciate you being here on hmTV today on the Fog War and Humanity and talking about things that they're not always easy to speak about. And I know your book is going to do a lot of good. It's going to do a lot of good itself. And it's on, right? You can get your book on Amazon, right?
On
Where
Amazon, Goodreads, you can go to your local bookstore.
Okay, Barnes and Nobles probably too, right? Or they could order it, and it's it's something we'd like to have you here again. I know we talked a lot, but just reach out to me if there's anything that we didn't go over. Down the road, we'll certainly go over it, and
I will talk with you about Vietnam anytime, Rich.
Yeah, this is good. It's very good, and I really appreciate your time and opening up to us. And have a great day. And I hope to talk to you soon. Okay. Take care. Bye bye. This has been the Fog of War and Humanity on hmTV. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again our next time around.